minutes, something like that? What are you planning?
We are going to run for 40 minutes, I think, Jonathan, and that's what everyone watching can feel excited to know, because we're live. Hello, everyone. I am still in Malawi. I'm in a different place now. We left the place we were on, Lekomo Island or something, and now we're in the capital, Lilongwe. And then we go somewhere else tomorrow. But anyway, I'm coming to you from Africa. Jonathan, you are coming to us from Cambridge?
Somewhere in the UK. No, the other place.
Oxford.
Yes.
There you go. Well, anyway, there you go, everybody. I answered your questions in the comments already. Thanks so much for joining us. We're joined by, I think this is the first time we've ever done a live stream with you, Jonathan, right?
This is the first one. This is absolutely it. Yeah, the first one. And I had the pleasure to speak to Jason Smart earlier. So this is my second conversation today. So hopefully I'm fired up and, not the usual weekend kind of slumber and dullness. I'm hopefully woken up for this.
Well, I appreciate that. Also, considering it is a Saturday night, so some people watching us might be like, "Do you guys have do you go out?" But you're coming back from a night out last night, by the sounds of it. You're nursing a little bit.
Yes, yeah. And for some miraculous reason, I have no hangover. Whereas by all rights, I should have an absolutely killer hangover. I'm having mixed beer and wine, but I feel clear as a bell. So I don't know who to thank for that.
Well, I'm glad to know. And to be fair, actually, people who might have never seen us collaborating before, what I think is cool is that we actually crossed paths about a month ago, almost a month ago.
That's the first time. That was ridiculous. Yeah. Yeah. And that was an interesting event. I mean, the topic is it may be not the most sort of vital topic of our times, but it was on Rasputin and there's quite a sort of popular theme, but it's interesting. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm going to wade through the book that I was persuaded to buy. But
you did buy it, didn't you? Yeah, I didn't buy it because as I think I told you at the time, and I just said to someone off air now, it was a very unpleasant experience. The author, Anthony Beaver, was it? I can't remember.
Yes.
He was quite hostile to me, even though I wanted
he was hostile to me as well. Yeah. Was he? I had the same experience. Yeah. I instantly regretted buying the book. So I went up, got the signature and said, I've been running a podcast for 4 years. It's had quite an impact and I've got a background as a historian. And he just looked up and went, "Oh, podcast? Oh God, no, ghastly. No, I never appear on one of those." I'm like, you've just maligned, what I've just told you what I do, and you've just basically done a giant shit on it. So thank you, Mr. Beaver, and F you. And then I regretted buying the book. I really want to go get my money back.
Wow, that's
what did he say to you? What did he say to you?
He didn't say that much. I just went over and I went, "Hello, Sir Anthony. I'm quite good at being I lived in DC for enough years, so I'm quite good at doing the whole schmoozing. Like, hello, Sir Anthony. I love the talk. Really interesting book. Really appreciated your answer to the questions. Brown nosing as much as possible. And I wanted to ask you." He's like, "Where's the book?" And I was like, I have a slight, I have an edge, which is if someone talks to me, I'm going to change, right? I'm not going to put up with bullshit. And he basically just said, "Where's the book?" And I was like, "Well, I actually wanted to invite you on the show, on my podcast, to promote your book, but I didn't finish all of the sentence because he went, I didn't have to. Where's the next person? Give me the book." And he almost hit me in the head with sort of his flailing of the arms, like not deliberately, but he was so incandescent with disinterest and rage.
Yes.
That
how dare the plebs engage me in conversation? That's not what I'm here for. That's the impression I got there.
It's not like the queue was that big. It was like 10
big at all. No.
Anyway, what I wanted to get your discussion with you tonight was simply things are really looking quite awkward for the Russians right now. Putin's comments in the past 24 hours. I mean, we can go back to VD parade and everything like that. But with the developments in the past few hours, the past day, with the Ukrainians striking and Putin saying he wants to retaliate, he vows revenge. He's really rattled, isn't he? This isn't something that a man in control of his war, a special operation, speaks like, is it?
I think not. And I haven't seen the full clip, but apparently at this Veterans Day, he was fairly incoherent. I mean, as I say, speaking to Jason Smart, he said he hasn't seen him that kind of incoherent. It almost looks like he was slightly drunk and certainly not in control of even the immediate environment he was with. Normally those events are packed with, one has to even wonder whether they're real veterans. Usually they're FSB officers dressed as members of the public, because he no longer has direct contact, I think, with people generally. And people have done OSINT and they said, okay, well, this person stood up here, here, and here. And in this instance, they were playing this character. So, but he does seem to not have the sort of coherence around his speech and his movement and his acts. I think there's some underlying disease there. We can't hope that he just pops his clogs. That's not a strategy. But it does seem the mixture of paranoia, the not feeling in control. I think he was deeply humiliated by Victory Day. I think there was no way he could sort of spin that. And I think he realized that he was belittled, not just externally, but internally as well. I think that has rattled him. And of course, he had this, demonstrative, huge airstrike on Kiev. In fact, it was quite dramatic because all through the day, the daytime before that huge strike, they were sending decoy drones in to sort of try to figure out where the air defense systems had been shifted to. 5 air alarms during the day. I mean, didn't stop anyone going about their shopping. Didn't stop me sitting there with Philip Ittner and having a couple of beers over a few hours. But constantly the alarms were going off and on. And then in the evening, of course, it was the largest strike of the war. But of course, many people who I spoke to who've got used to actually sleeping through the average bombardment, as mad as that sounds, they only sent in 100 drones last night, I slept through it, etc. Nobody slept in this. Windows were rattling. It was 8-9 hours long. So he wants to lash out whenever he feels that he is weak, whenever he feels there's any humiliation, which of course is the last thing you need as a strong man. He feels he lashes out. I suspect that he now feels that he no longer has the tools to lash out and inflict that kind of, whether you want to call it revenge or whatever, or that extreme violence, because 94% of those projectiles were shot down. Yes, I think 24 or more people were killed, which is absolutely horrific. But I think he would want to inflict far more death and suffering, and he just doesn't have the means to do it at this point, unless, of course, he steps up and maybe fires an Oreshnik into an urban center. But of course, he probably also rationally knows that the stakes of doing it, the optics of doing that, come with potentially other risks that may rebound quite harshly on him. And I'm not one who thinks he'll go nuclear, even tactical. I think he knows that is a line too far for China, and he's absolutely dependent on Chinese support. It's a line too far for Europe. I'm not sure what the response would be, but I think the absolute horror if he went to that level of nuclear revenge or even nuclear symbolism is. So what has he got? What tools has he got? I think he's really feeling that powerlessness.
Yeah, I don't even really think about the nuclear element, not because I don't think it's obviously an option, but because regardless of the detestation we have for Putin, he's still somewhat of a rational actor. I don't think he wants to be the one who subjected Russia to complete destruction. Right? He's supposed to be the protector and the glory neo-Tsar of it. So tactical nuclear possibly is a symbolic strike. There was one assessment by, I think it was CSIS or RUSI or something, and it was sort of like he might strike in the Sea of Azov, right, as a sort of
off the coast somewhere. Exactly.
Russia is in a deep strike scenario. But
as Margarita Simonyan suggested 2 years ago, why don't we nuke ourselves just to show that we can do it? I mean, I think that was going too far, even for her fellow propagandists,
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I did want to come a little bit to your personal experiences, given you were visiting just recently. But I just wanted to give a little bit more context for people who are joining and sort of what we're talking about because of the past few hours. So Putin basically has promised retaliation after he accused Ukraine of carrying out this deadly attack on a supposed student dormitory in an occupied part of Ukraine. 18 people have been killed and 42 others were injured in the town of Staryoblitsk in the Luhansk region. Now, Ukraine's military said it hit the headquarters of Russia's elite Rubicon drone military facility, and it didn't say whether it was the one that Russia identified. But what's, I think, most interesting and sort of goes to what you just said, Jonathan, is that often with Putin, you can tell a lot by how rattled he is or not, by how much he says, doesn't say, whether he appears. Like in times of crisis, he often disappears. Like we don't see him for days. Like there was he doing Wagner and all that stuff. But in this instance, he's pretty pissed because he's very definitive. Like he says, he categorically said no military facilities, intelligence service facilities, or related services in the vicinity. I'll just read a bit more. Therefore, there is absolutely no basis for claiming that the munitions struck the building as a result of our air defense or electronic warfare systems, he said at this reception, as you said. That's pretty detailed for him.
Usually that's quite detailed. He never goes into that detail.
He's feeling rattled because he feels that need to clarify it that much. At least that's how I read that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd agree, but like, yeah, he looked pretty unsettled in his delivery.
It's also an admission. I mean, if you read between the lines, it's also an admission that many of the other strikes that incidentally hit apartment blocks and so on were not being targeted by Ukraine specifically, but it's Russian air defense electronic warfare has either physically blown them off course or captured them electronically to hit civilian objects. He's basically sort of admitted there that all the other strikes are not Ukrainians hitting civilians. How dare they do this? Now, we know that there are huge numbers of students being trained to build drones, let's say at Alaburga, that there are many foreigners who have been sort of conned into doing that. There are many, many students, tens of thousands of students actually training for Rubicon because they have the aim to build 100,000, 120,000 strong elite drone force. So even if this was a sort of objigitor or a hostile, it's entirely possible that it may have contained or entirely been dedicated to training people up to be drone pilots. It's not inconceivable, despite what he says, and Putin lies. But I think being rattled is certainly there. Now, whether he's rattled because he thought that these drone units were untouchable, or whether this is a genuine accident, mistargeting. But then again, has Putin ever cared for his own civilians? If you go back to the sinking of the Kursk and the absolute contempt that he has for his own people, I don't think we can interpret this like, there's been some civilian death toll. Oh, isn't it tragic? And he doesn't give a damn, and he never has given a damn about people or the lives of soldiers or students or anyone else. That's not who he is. So we have to say, well, why would he be rattled by such an incident? And I think it's because it shows him to be weak. It shows him to be powerless. And whether it was an elite drone force being trained or not, it essentially shows that he's no longer in control of Russian airspace, strategic objectives, civilian objectives. And we're seeing choruses of criticism, especially amongst the Z Patriot community, not saying like the war was wrong and we shouldn't be killing Ukrainians. They're mostly upset that they're not killing enough, but they're upset that they realize now that their strategic objectives won't be met. And there's a chorus of objections to actually continuation of the war. People are in the elite sort of, I'd say, somewhat fearful of where this will lead, because the further it goes, the greater the economic calamity at the end of it, and the less control potentially either Putin's regime or the regime that follows it will be able to sort of glue things back together. So I think he's entering quite a fevered and paranoid state. That kind of means that whenever Ukraine strikes strategically and hard, or creates the optics of Russia being undefended, everything is now going to be impacting on his psyche.
I want to dissect that a little bit further, but I did see something from, I think he supports you, Jonathan, BME.
BME, he does. He's one of our expert moderators. He's a Vatnik basher extraordinaire.
Well, he just came over from your channel to smash the like button on mine. Yeah. So I'm just going to say for both of us, if you don't support Jonathan and you're on Jonathan's and you don't support me, supporters, like each video, or I don't know, do something like that. I'm not great. I'm too British. I'm very uncomfortable in asking, to like and subscribe and all that. Yeah. But
me too. But sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to build things up. Yeah.
But just on that point then, so I think what's really interesting about this, Jonathan, is that what does this do? This doesn't only demonstrate that Putin is losing the capacity to illustrate himself as protector and, the sort of to reestablish the great Russian Empire, or whatever, neo-Russian sort of resurgence of Russia as a great power. But also it's undermining the very thing that he based a lot of his entire SMO of this invasion, wasn't it? The protection or liberation of the Russian oppressed people in eastern Ukraine. And now they're being targeted, or whatever, the Russians are not even able to defend them. He has no capacity to explain this, right?
No, and again, we have to put in context in that, did he ever care about the people of Donetsk and Luhansk? No. Essentially, he has turned Donbass into a gulag, an open-air gulag. I mean, the people of Donbass, especially in the villages, especially those who, let's say, have, and at this point, actually, it doesn't matter if they have sympathy for Russia or not, I mean, Ukraine or not, rather. They're all targeted similarly. They're all prone to the total lack of law, lack of infrastructure, total impunity of the sort of criminal forces that have been put in charge of those territories. If you're in villages, you can be looted, beaten, killed, raped at will. There's no rule of law there whatsoever. So we got to dispense with this idea that somehow he cares about the people in these areas, but he absolutely doesn't. For months now, they've had brown sludge coming out of their taps with no water and very little sort of supply. So he's reduced these territories to essentially an area of absolute horror. And I think the horror is something we'll only find out about later. So again, he does not care. What he cares about is the implication that he is weak, the implication that he has lost control, the implication that he can no longer, command authority within the vertical of power. That is what exercises him.
No, absolutely, and I think I wanted to also unpack. Sorry, my phone is saying I've got low battery, so I'm just going to fiddle with my wires here. But yeah, Zelensky said, I think was it on Thursday, that the Ukrainians hit an FSB headquarters. They killed about 100.
Yeah, I think that was the claim. Yes.
Yeah, and what I find interesting is that it's such an obviously bad situation that even Russian military had to comment on the issue, or one pro-Kremlin Telegram, I'm just reading this from an article here, reported casualties after what it said, quote, massive drone strike. So clearly, as you say, the Telegram channels, the Russian bloggers who want to be pro-Putin, pro the war, etc., are having to admit that we are facing serious issues here, and they can't even get away with the issue,
And it's also an intelligent strategy, because if you can hit the infrastructure of the Siloviki, that is going to have far more impact on Putin, because if he cannot protect his protectors, the core that is there to prop up his regime, if they are no longer protected, and if they are no longer necessarily getting the resources they need, I don't think we've reached that point where he can no longer supply the FSB with the resources they require. But if he can not provide protection to them, then that's a serious, I think, threat to him. And there are some of these Z patriots who are starting to ask the question, why do we need Putin? If Putin cannot, arbitrate between different factions, which is very much his role within the system, preventing open warfare between mafia and Siloviki factions, if he can no longer, keep them down and stop the squabbling and the theft amongst themselves, if he can no longer protect physically, our ill-gotten gains and wealth and status, what is Putin for? And isn't it time we got a strong man who actually protects our interests?
No, for sure. I think it's pretty clear that the elite, a month ago, Putin was basically saying, hey, can you give me some money, please? Which I never thought I would ever see reported. I've got an interesting question here from one of your subscribers, Andreas, which I thought would. So he said, I'm guessing you're based in Germany, Andreas, but he says there's a massive problem with the Russian disinformation, which I do find Germany is particularly targeted in a way that Britain is sort of targeted in a kinetic war sense, whilst the Germans seem to be a recipient of more cyber war. But he's asking, how is it in the UK? Like, how is Russian disinformation in the UK?
It's far more subtle, I think, and I've got some friends who are working on this. They interview people who voted for. No, we now have an outbreak of the centre is fragmenting, as is the Conservative Party and the Labour Party's traditional support. So we have, a growth obviously in reform, and there's another one, I don't know what's it called, revival or whatever the hell it is. And then we have the Greens. And so we have these sort of movements. That's the horseshoe theory. And of course, if you go far enough left or far enough right, you will find people who are apparently sympathetic to Russian narratives. So in the extreme left and extreme right, we sort of hear quite a lot of this fringe stuff, especially like, well, of course, Russia's war is wrong, but actually NATO is equally culpable, blah, blah, blah. Someone in the comments just now repeated one of those sort of classic lines, which I actually heard from someone yesterday, which is, why are you caring about Ukraine when Boris Johnson and Britain, torpedoed the Istanbul deal? And I actually argue this with the Ukrainian, say, she was saying, oh, well, there was a deal on the table. There was a deal to destroy Ukraine. There was a deal to hollow out its military. There was a deal to take vast chunks of its territory, have a pause, and then start again. That's not a deal in my book whatsoever. And they were absolutely right to fight on. And Johnson was absolutely right to say, no, we're going to commit to support you. So don't sign a deal that will hollow out your state and lead to its eventual destruction. But it is, a classic Kremlin line. We don't hear too much of that in Britain. And I say it's only from fairly extreme quarters. The rest is just things you hear out of ignorance. There'll be a lot of pro-Ukraine people who will sort of say things that maybe just aren't quite correct, but that's just about getting good information and having a good debate about things. We're far less susceptible to it than other countries. Whereas, however, what I fear is that we have a lot of internal problems, which of course populist politicians are leveraging. So Farage wouldn't pop up and say, well, we're going to de-support Ukraine. What he will say is, well, we should deal with our own problems first. Yeah. So the real danger is finding ways to defund and de-support Ukraine without explicitly saying so. And there are narratives, I think, which unfortunately will work in our current sort of fevered politics and the state of sort of economic duress that we're under.
Yeah, I just add to that simply that to me, the Germany is obviously Central Europe, and it's gotten its divided political climate at the moment. The AfD are very popular in certain areas, i.e. Eastern Germany, right? And the split there, if you look at any political map or demographic breakdown of Germany along voting lines or social and economic patterns, you can clearly see that the divide
east-west, doesn't it? Yeah,
very strongly.
But their narratives are so much more clearly pro-Russian. I mean, their narratives are, myth, propaganda line after propaganda line. I mean, it's absolutely overt, the sort of lines they're delivering. I would say they even go further than some of the stuff Trump said, although he said some pretty horrible things over the last year or two that have certainly been fed by his inner circle, some in his inner circle, and even conversations had with Putin. Often after these conversations, he'll repeat these narratives. But the AfD are absolutely consistent, and they take the most extreme, I would say, sort of Vatnik point of view. I find that extremely dangerous. The question in my mind is what will Putin do if he is under this psychological pressure? And I think you're absolutely right in pointing that out. It's coming across in his manner, his tone. He's saying and doing things that he previously has not. He would have let minions handle these statements. He would have let Dmitry Peskov or the propagandist say the things that he's been saying in the last couple of days. Now he's saying them directly. It smacks of a certain desperation. But what does Putin do when he's desperate? Does he lie down and stick his legs in the air? That's not who he is. He's like a cornered rat. He'll come out scratching and biting. So it is a question of what he does, what he can do, and what he will find to do. Because if he says he wants revenge, and let's face it, him threatening to strike Kiev, well, he struck Kiev almost every night of this war anyway. He had concessions on Victory Day. He then launched a mass attack on Ukraine anyway. It's using the word revenge somehow implies that this is a sort of reciprocal thing. And it almost covers up the fact that Putin will lash out and strike anyway. Whether Ukraine fights back or whether they don't, they're going to be subject to the same violence. So I don't think it works in that classic mechanic.
No, I just want to show this image here because I think that this right here, I mean, I know it's mid-speech, but when he was giving the delivery of this VD speech, his mannerisms, his facial expressions, his gestures reminded me very much of the day that the full-scale invasion happened. There was a certain level of him portraying, he was incensed with a sense of frustration, rage, dissatisfaction, or the reality of the war being what it is, which is not going well. I haven't seen that sort of, he looks genuinely angry in this screenshot. I know it's mid-wording, but like, he still looks like, if you watch that, you know, when he sits at his desk and he goes on and on about why this war is justified and the relationship of Russia to the West and Ukraine and etc. He is really animated, really agitated. And I just, normally when he gives these kinds of public appearances, he's quite measured. Like, you know, when you see him,
he's usually quite cold. Yes, there's a sort of calculation, isn't there, to him?
So I know it's a small case, but I think it's important. I think it demonstrates him losing himself in public, which he doesn't normally do.
No, normally he's completely in control of that. And in fact, historically, because I spoke to someone who actually was part of his speechwriting team. This was an interesting night in the pub a couple of years back where, and this is a very intelligent, you know, researcher with a PhD and whatever in history. And she described to me the architecture of his speechwriting. This isn't the classic, you know, pre full-scale invasion where everything is architected, where every one of his public appearances is engineered to make him look good. You'd have a team of dozens of people, and they'd write a pure script without any propaganda, using absolute experts, historians, and so on. And then it goes through layer after layer as they gradually tweak it and refine it and, you know, twist it into something that's sort of more propagandistic. It's just the mechanics of that strike me as extraordinary. So that's the background of orchestrating his image and his words very, very carefully. What you say here is interesting because he seems to be speaking more off the cuff here, and this is more directly him. It's unpolished, it's slightly demented, it's impassioned. I wondered two things. One, whether he has really, you know, started to believe his own mythology, believe his own lies and propaganda. I rather suspect since COVID he has, you know, not been as detached as he used to be. He's developed a passion for this pseudo history, and he probably believes part of it. He may also be fed completely false information that actually the war's going okay, he's going to win, and eventually they're going to get the whole of Donbass, or Ukraine's going to fold, etc. So I wonder whether there isn't also some anger here that he's being fed one picture, and yet the information he's also getting from other quarters doesn't really match. And he's maybe feeling this sort of dissonance between, you know, or detecting maybe that somehow his view of reality isn't sort of matching up. Maybe an anger and you know, with his own inner circle, but not sure how to direct it. We don't know that. I mean, this is just pure speculation, but certainly that frustration is apparent.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that he's lost the capacity to portray things in a way he wanted, and he's having to react more instead of dictate the terms. I mean, just look at the way that he's increasingly attacked Europe. I just want to bring back to answer the question that was put before, right? In the case of Britain, whilst in Germany, perhaps it's more about the political influence and psychological warfare. In England, it's much more of provocations through kinetic means. What I mean by that is that we've seen with the Yantar, I think it is, that ship that has been bobbing around parts of the North Sea, the British Isles. The Russians see the Brits as enemy number one now because of Trump's sort of apparent love for Putin. So the way that the Russians engage the British is very different to the Germans. There's a lot more military activity. There's a lot more physical means. And I think that has partially to do with Britain as an intelligence hub, but also because of its just geographical location, right? When we think of Britain, we should think of its relationship to Greenland and Iceland, the GI-UK gap, because that is a central strategic access point for the Russians from the Arctic into the Atlantic. And therefore, if the Russians can undermine the UK and NATO with one of the most important means, that's a huge win for them. And given the whole political drama in the UK right now and Scottish independence and this whole idea of Trident being affected, that's a huge, therefore, escalation for NATO's, one of its cornerstone deterrence means, right? So I think for the Russians, you know, like it or not, they're quite good at identifying the comparative disadvantages of each, or like the Achilles heel. And I think in the UK, it's that element versus the Germans, which are, it's different. So I don't know if you would agree with that, but I see that quite distinctively for me. And to your point about Putin, just actually made me think of, like, we've both, I think, hosted Mark Galotti in the past.
Correct,
Great expert on Russia. And he's, he's talked about different phases of Putin, which I think is very true, right? Putin went through different psychological changes, his early 2000s, and then after the Munich Security Conference, that was the next phase, and then after the Snow Revolution of 2012, and then after sort of COVID, right? He's increasingly become more paranoid, more autocratic. He's done these mini purges to centralize control more, to reduce his inner circle, and more he's isolated himself. And as you say, like, I never really used to think of him as an ideologue. But goodness me, when he wrote that article in 21 about Ukraine and the relationship to Russia, it became very clear just how ideologically he is driven, especially or specifically about Ukraine, right? It's crazy.
That's the point where I thought, okay, this is happening, because it is quite literally the Bond villain telling you what they're going to do, monologuing, and you think, no matter how mad it sounds, this is what he's going to do. This is Blofeld. This is Goldfinger. They're absolutely barking mad, but here they go. They've told you the whole plot, the whole script. It's also the Mein Kampf moment. And again, I think we think back to the 1930s, British diplomats and analysts and others had access to that. And they read it and they thought, well, this guy's a bit of a clown and this stuff he's written is barking mad. So we can't take this at all seriously because it's not going to happen. Well, hello. When the bad guy tells you what they're going to do, just I fucking believe them, because this is what he's done, as unhinged as it seems. I mean, it's interesting. Certain historians and many Russian oppositionists who previously I thought were quite accurate in their descriptions all said he's not going to invade. So I wouldn't point the finger at some British historians who, for instance, advised the British government and said, no, I mean, despite your intelligence data, it doesn't make any sense. He's not going to invade. I think we have to park rationality, and this is very important when we're dealing with Putin. We have to park what we think is rationality. We have to park what we think is reasonable and achievable, because he's working from a very different framework. He's working towards very different ends. He's not really has to be accountable to his people in any way whatsoever. And he is also working with different information. He's working with a vertical hierarchy that is entirely built to tell him what he wants to hear. I mean, this is a system that didn't start out this way, but he's architected so that only people who are sycophants and loyalists make it in that system. So it's completely deformed by his own, his own dictatorial ego, I would say.
Yeah, I just actually, you made me think of something about when this was happening. There was a great article in the, am I lagging? There was a great article in Al Jazeera about 2 weeks before the invasion. It was an opinion piece, but needless to say, I didn't decide to reach out to the author because he didn't do a great job of predicting the conflict. I just remember reading this and I was like, all the signs are pointing to the complete opposite.
They're pointing to the complete opposite. And one can see why they don't, they'll look at it and say, well, that doesn't make any sense, because one, military people say, well, you can have enough force to take a country that large against an army. You need 5 to 8 times the number of troops. Rather than the 200,000 that were gathered north of Kiev, in hindsight, one, maybe you shouldn't have invaded across multiple fronts in that fashion, but theoretically he should have had an army that was several times larger than the one that he actually put in the field. So in hindsight, that all kind of makes sense. But at the time, I think a lot of people were like, this is the 21st century. People don't do that. My question is, well, what else are we presuming? What else are we assuming that can't happen in the 21st century? And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of things we're assuming can't happen, but a desperate Putin would not have those same barriers. For instance, a full-scale hybrid attack on Europe, a kinetic attack using drones on Europe, let's say to shut down European airspace, to damage our economies, combined with a full-scale psychological informational campaign to try to destabilize our governments. You can see how this might work in parts of Germany. Like if the economy is going down, airspace is shut, Russia is attacking, There will be politicians that say, oh, hang on a second, I can save you from this. All we have to do is come to some accommodation with Russia, start buying their oil again. I can make this all go away. I can lower your bills. Why are we starting World War III with Russia? And they'll actually frame it as if it was their fault, as if, let's say, we the Germans provoked this, like poking the bear and stuff. And you can see maybe how this strategy might actually play to Putin's advantage, which is terrifying.
Yeah, no, you echo a lot of what Wesley Clark, I had him on the show about 2 weeks ago, the former NATO commander during the Kosovo War. And it was really interesting to hear someone who's been in the room with the Russians in such a pivotal time of history, and in, for a good few years at the highest level of NATO-Russian relations. But someone, I think it's Silkat, has just put one word, nukes, which I think is indicative, but also it's a good point, because I wanted to get your thoughts on the recent Russian nuclear, they've put a bunch of them in Belarus,
yes,
or whatever this was yesterday. So what's your take on that, considering everything else that's going on?
I mean, they also wheeled out Karaganov yet again to do his rabid Bond villain, bald-headed, madness. And that tells me that it's highly performative. I think, again, Putin might have bad information. He might think that an invasion on Kiev from the Belarusian side, backed up with the idea of nukes, like don't fight back or we'll nuke you, that will somehow be a deterrent. Again, I don't think he would actually use them, because that would really be a rupture with China, which is entirely dependent on. If China literally severed the link, and I think China would, because that's a huge systemic shock to China if the world, went into some kind of recession as a result of Russia really stepping over that line, which I think it would. I think it would trigger extraordinary turbulence in the markets, potentially leading to global economic crash. So behind the scenes, I think it's like, no way. India also would probably balk at that, even though they're quite happy to gobble up Russian oil like there's no tomorrow. Not that it's helping their economy much. No gloating there, but so again, I think it's part of the theater, the psychology of threat. Now, I suspect that the Belarusian army would not really make much of a dent. It was said that if he'd sent them across in 2022, they'd have been made mincemeat of then. Now, of course, Ukraine is far, far more geared up and has the skill, munition, troop numbers, and actually has many, many units, one presumes, along that sort of border area between Belarus and Kiev. They would be, it would not go well for them, put it that way. It would be an irritant to Ukraine, but it would certainly not go well with Belarus, to the point where it may even destabilize the Lukashenko regime to the point of revolution and collapse. So is Putin prepared to take risks like that? Is he prepared to take risks like that because he doesn't realize the risk he's taking? This is a house of cards. He may bring the whole thing down in his desperation. We just don't know. I mean, we're at an extraordinary pivot point here, where Putin has made all sorts of decisions, and he almost lost Iran as an ally. He lost Syria as an ally. His actions may well bring about the demise of one of his core allies, Lukashenko. Orban, of course, wasn't saved by Russian intervention. Quite the reverse. France and Russian propagandists to try to prop up that regime accelerated the vote towards his opponent. So Putin, in his desperation, may well make some really disastrous decisions that make his position far, far worse. There is also, and it throws back to you, there's one of the discussion points, because one of the correspondents I listen to every day is Michael Naki, along with Vitaly Portikov and a few others in Russian language. But Michael Naki has a great team of researchers, and he goes through and he lists all the different theories and why certain things might be happening. Well, Putin's made a whole bunch of really quite terrible decisions with knock-on effects on the Russian economy. There is one school of thought that says, actually, there are people within the regime who are feeding him advice to make terrible decisions in order to accelerate the decline of his power and trying to provoke some kind of opposition to it. They would frame the culling of cattle in Siberia as one of those. The regime's done something very heavy-handed, which it turns out every Russian was talking about that. Every dissident Russian or diaspora Russian was talking about that, and how awful it is that the regime are culling these cattle and ruining people's livelihoods. It seems very despotic and sort of vicious. It also seems odd when Ukrainians say, frankly, that Russians should be really so exercised about cattle. But that is what it is. So that's one school of thought, that actually, they don't have necessarily the political organization to lead a coup, but they may be just bringing Putin along down a certain path, which they think will lead to his demise and doom. But again, it's not a transparent system, so we just don't know.
Well, it's an interesting theory. I think that may well have been something that we've both heard from another guest we host, which is Konstantin Samelyov, right, of Inside Russia. He often appears on our shows, and he, I think this was about a month ago, he first notified to me this idea that cattle were being culled in the tens of thousands in Siberia and other parts of the Far East, because of the sheer conditions and just economic situation.
Foot and mouth is the undisclosed reason for it, but they don't want to say foot and mouth because they've only just gained they gain valuable export dollars, which they're using on the SVR. And if they declared a foot and mouth crisis, that would shut off export markets. So there's a logical reason why they might do that and deploy all this subterfuge, but just the optics of them turning up at farms, destroying people's livelihoods with no compensation and no reason given, it's made quite an impression on people. I mean, I do find it horrific that makes an impression on people, but apartment buildings full of children and families being slaughtered doesn't. But that's again, we don't know necessarily what people think in a dictatorship, but I suspect that there's not that many Russians giving too much thought to the Ukrainian suffering, or whereas their own loss of sort of, let's say, privilege, internet access, convenient lifestyles, that does seem to get people quite angry. But that's...
Yeah, I mean, look, as soon as it starts happening in the urban centers, as we see internet outages, as we see deliberate clamping down on certain information, as we've seen happening in the biggest of hubs, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Ekaterinburg, and obviously Minsk and everywhere else, it's not something that you can pull the wool over people's eyes. And people are aware of that. The biggest, obviously, question all the time, and we've seen it in a couple of comments in the stream so far, is what does it take for the Russian people to stand up? And that's unfortunately the critical question, but also a very unlikely one to see happen still.
It's a very unlikely one to see happen because conditions in the villages are probably not great, but then they've always been not great, and it's not since the revolutionary period that anything like the discontent was there. And to an extent, Russia was far more politicized, ironically, in the early 20th century than it is now. It's been beaten out of them, and educated out this what's called learned helplessness. There's far less, I would say, politics, active, organic politics in Russia now than there would have been in the period following the 1905 revolutions, and so there's not much to work on. I don't expect any uprising. What may be more realistic is let's say some kind of elite coup. And there's a long history in Russia, of course, of
there's never been a transition of power, has there?
No, there's never been a democratic transition of power. No, not once. No. And people say, "What about Yeltsin?" Well, I'm afraid I have certain views on that. I mean,
opportunity of which didn't go anywhere. It lasted about 2 years, and even that.
And his route into power was very much managed and orchestrated to an extent by certain factions within the Siloviki. So there's never been a there's never been an organic. No.
But I just wanted to add a quick comment on Belarus, and then I want to get the last thing I wanted to ask you a bit was about China, Russia, and the visit. But from my perspective, to what people's asked and said about Belarus, I mean, Belarus has been floated in and out of the war several times, but I don't think we've really heard anything about Belarus joining the war since 2024. And even then, it was never really likely. The Belarusian army is non-existent.
And there's a lot of resistance as well. Apparently, there's a lot of antipathy there amongst the military hierarchy. They would not look kindly on being sent into the meat grinder.
How much of a shit show it's gone down for the
Yeah.
supposedly second largest powerful army in the world, or fourth most powerful in Ukraine after the tractors and the and the legions and everything else.
Let's not forget the housewives, you know, as the CEO of Rheinmetall said, Ukrainian housewives, the third most powerful army in Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, Belarus is nothing. And to be honest with you, you know, I look at Lukashenko like I look on certain countries that want to remain, like Vucic comes to mind. And I know the circumstances are different, but in the principle of hedging, right? They're trying to hedge their bets by sort of staying on good, reasonable terms with Moscow, but also keeping the door ajar with Europe. Right, Lukashenko did, I think, what was it, a few months ago? He loosened, or he released a bunch of political prisoners, I think, and that was sort of meant to be seen as in good favor and trying to get sanctions relief. And maybe this was with the U.S. administration, but I think he's been trying to keep, you know, some assurances if, you know, day zero occurs with Putin in Moscow, that he doesn't lose power as well. You know, he's still trying to keep his own interests ahead of Putin, regardless of their unique relationship. I think that's quite.
I think so. I don't think China wants to see Putin fall, but also I don't think they're prepared to sign a blank check for that. There are limits to what they're prepared to do.
Well, the key thing with that is, of course, I mean, if we just bring in China bluntly, then it's the power of Siberia 2 pipeline. Putin went there with the desire to get that deal signed. And this has been going on for the best part of a decade. I think he's been trying to get China to agree. The Chinese will not accept certain price points because they think, well, they have the leverage. The Russians don't want to accept reduced prices because they can't afford it. So Putin comes back from Beijing empty-handed, despite talking about the liberal friendship and all that. So
there's no Nord Stream 3. That's the long-held dream. It's not been agreed, and it's likely not going to happen. And even if they were to agree, I mean, how long would it take to build that infrastructure? Not within the time frame of this war, anyway. That would really benefit him in any case. So I think he's going to struggle here. And obviously, they've been trying to get the Americans to help as much as possible. And there's been certain people within the Trump administration who've been quite happy to lend that assistance, whether it be Eldridge Colby sort of sucking troops out of Europe, or trying to get sort of Patriot interceptors sent to other places, kicking wars off all over the place to try and distract. You know, it's not worked, and Ukraine has found ways to hit Russian oil infrastructure. So what we have to ask, and this is the scary one for me, is what else could China do? If it's not going to go all in with Russia, which I don't think it will economically, if it's not going to go in militarily, I don't think China will send troops in like North Korea did. North Korea is sort of proxy for China in that sense, but they're not going to send, you know, their own Red Army in. What could China do to prevent a Russian collapse and, you know, still come away with a sense that, you know, they've actually got. I don't think they actually care if Russia sort of nominally loses the war, as long as China feels it's come out on top. But it may feel that Putin needs a bit of assistance to sort of keep going. Well, the obvious one, of course, is to kick off the blockade of Taiwan. That may be seen as the most effective strategy to move forward their plans for global domination, but also to aid their ailing ally, Putin, which would really take the Americans' attention away from Europe. Well, it's already taken away to an extent. But that will put the nail in the coffin of that. The other tactic, of course, would be for Russia to really step up attacks on Europe so that we start stockpiling weapons, interceptors, and possibly our economies come under extreme duress from hybrid attacks and sabotage, which would then allow them to, you know, step up their political psychological campaign. I think there's evidence of that happening. There's evidence of them trying to already launder their reputation through the Venice Biennale, through the trying to get, you know, various disciplines like gymnastics readmitted into world sport. These things don't happen accidentally. We have to imagine that huge funding has gone into these things, you know, massive bribes, massive networks of supporters, probably massive compromat has gone on behind the scenes to try to rehabilitate Russia. So I think they're starting to hedge. They're starting to say, okay, we need a post-war strategy, either to integrate ourselves in Europe, and to whitewash our crimes, and that's kind of playing out. But they say also maybe that's not the way to go. We'll invest in it, but that maybe actually attacking Europe and trying to break it up into a mosaic of states, some pro-Russian, some anti-Russian, but essentially not being a coherent force to fight back. That could be the other way it goes. At the moment, I suspect they're building both of those strategies and may not have decided exactly which way to go. But how China reacts to Taiwan may decide it. If Putin sees that going on, he may say, "Okay, well, this is the chance, right? Let's hit Europe when it's largely undefended."
Yeah, I think that's a good point to sort of wrap. I think soon, but I would just add, look, for the years I've spent studying China, it's very much an undecided. It's very undecided what China wants. Do they want to be a global hegemon? Do they want to just be the regional leader? Or do they just want to be a status quo power? This concept, they benefit from the status quo, the system as it is. They don't really care where they get their energy, where they get their whatever, where they can prosper from, and as long as they can. So they don't care who runs Russia as long as Russia is inherently useful to them. Their relationship is a strategic convenience. It's a utility for the Chinese. I think that
they've got Russia where they want. Russia is essentially a vassal of China now. They've achieved their strategic objective. Yeah.
No, largely speaking, I wonder. I mean, there was one comment I read in the news, I think it was Reuters yesterday, and she had apparently told Trump that he thought Putin would come to regret the war. Now, that's about as sort of animated a comment you get from President Xi Jinping.
Quite something, though, isn't it? I mean, that's unexpected.
But I think the last point I'll just end, and I hate to end it on this tang. He is unfortunately the deciding factor, which is, I think, a large proportion of whether China is willing to support Russia depends on Trump's actions over Taiwan. I made a video a couple of days ago about Trump's comments because he's basically putting Taiwan under the crossfire now. If Trump is unwilling to support Taiwan with military aid and change the recognition of Taiwan as a this strategic ambiguity, the Taiwan Relations Act, then that's going to incentivize Xi Jinping, the CCP, to really, I think, up the pressure on Taiwan, which will obviously then that will trickle down to their relationship with Moscow and how that impacts Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. So it all quickly becomes intertwined, even more than it already is, because of Trump's decision making. I
think it's as good as abandoned Taiwan. I mean, it reminds me of the Falklands, which I do remember, which is when we withdrew our destroyers and our nominal protection of the islands. That gave a huge green signal to Argentina to invade. We essentially removed the deterrence and created the idea that we were no longer interested in that territory. Well, Trump has just signaled exactly the same around Taiwan, that we're not going to defend it. We don't care. It's not that important. It's a massive green signal. In the same way, I'm afraid to say, that Biden gave a green signal to Putin prior to the invasion of Ukraine, which was to say, well, we don't agree with this. We know what you're up to, but we're not going to prevent you from doing it. That, unfortunately, in politics, that removal of ambiguity and power of deterrence is a green light to invasion. And I think Trump's done that.
No, very, very astute point. But Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Phil. Best part of an hour, and we'll definitely have to do this again. Maybe we can grab another Russia-Ukraine orientated creator colleague to join us.
Yes, that'd be great. Let's do that.
I have to actually bounce now because I have another stream that I've scheduled in 10 minutes. So on Iran, we're returning to Iran.
Hopefully you have time to relax as well, based on where you are. You need some time, some downtime as well. Yeah,
I do, but lots happening and the world waits for no man. So we've got to keep going. But do be sure everyone to check out
this opportunity. It's great to be here.
No, absolutely. We'll do it again. And as I say, everyone do check out the Silicon Curtain. Jonathan, I mean, you tell me to take a moment's reprieve, but you're hosting guest after guest and all these podcasts, which I don't even know how you manage to put out like 3 or 4 a day sometimes, or 2 a day.
I've got a twin, I've got a twin. It's so that I don't tell anyone about.
Oh, nice.
No, I don't really.
Behind the scenes. But yeah, thanks a lot, Jonathan. Everyone for watching.
Cheers, Potter.
Have a good Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.